I wanna be a producer with a hit show on Broadway. I wanna be a producer.
Hey everybody, it's Ken Davenport. Before we get into this week's podcast, did you know that I have a theater with my name on it? Okay, it's not really my name. It's named after my great-grandfather, Delbert Essex Davenport. He was this crazy Ziegfeld-like wannabe from way back in the day. He was a publicist, he was a producer, he was a lyricist. You name it, he did it. He wore a lot of hats. Sound familiar? It's like this guy. Anyway, I named my theater after him, and guess what? That theater is available for rent. We do workshops, readings, full productions. We have a 60-seat black box and a 150-seat main stage. So check it out at davenporttheater.com. That's davenporttheater.com. We'd love to host your show. Now, on to the podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Producer's Perspective podcast. I am Ken Davenport, and I'm so excited about today's guest because if you are interested in Broadway and the theater, then you, without a doubt, have read today's guest. But today, you're going to hear from him. I'm honored to have in me one of the most influential people in the world of theater, the Chief Drama Critic of the New York Times, Ben Brantley. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you so much.
Now, this is the part of the podcast where I usually talk about some of the things my guest has done and list their credits. But I think the title Chief Drama Critic of the New York Times says it all. Although part of me wants to introduce him like a movie trailer, the man who makes producers' dreams come true or can break a heart with a few strokes of his pen, but I won't do that. So, Ben, let's just start at the beginning. Mm-hmm. How did you get to the Chief Critic desk?
Oh, it was a long and winding road. The first job interview I had outside of college was with John Fairchild, who was the head of Fairchild Publications, died recently. But he asked me if I could have any job in the world. What would it be? And I said, Chief Theater Critic of the New York Times. And we both sort of laughed at that because it seemed like an impossible dream. And it obviously wasn't what I was interviewing for. And I did get the job there covering sportswear news for Women's Wear Daily. From there, I wound up covering fashion for them. I went to their Paris office. From there, I went to work for Tina Brown for 7 years, first at Vanity Fair, then the New Yorker. At the same time, I was doing movie reviews for Elle magazine. My first editor there was Alex Witchell, who was engaged to a man named Frank Rich, who was then the theater critic of the New York Times. When they were looking for a new second-string critic, she said, well, I know you like theater. Do you mind if we throw your name into the hat? Or Frank actually called and asked that. And I said, oh, yeah, right. And then it happened very quickly. And I've been there for, 22 years.
So where did the love of theater come from? What was the first moment?
Oh, it was really early. My mother had been in love with theater, had studied at the Provincetown Playhouse. But I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My granddad taught Shakespeare, so I was read, Lamb's Tales of Shakespeare, even when I was before I could actually properly read. And the university, or college it was then, Wake Forest, where my dad worked, had a very active theater department, and when they needed a spare kid, I went into that. And it was magic for me. I mean, theater and books I fell in love with around the same time, and they've been, two loves that haven't let me down.
And do you remember the first Broadway show you
Sure,
saw?
Absolutely. It was Follies, the original Follies. I was I think 15. It was the first time I came to New York, and it happened to be the show my dad had gotten tickets for, with Alexis Smith, Dorothy Collins, John McMartin, who is still very active. And it was thrilling, the musical numbers, the staging. It was the perfect introduction to Broadway, now that I look back on it, and that it was sort of an elegy for a Broadway that was disappearing. It was having a Stephen Sondheim show for the first time, and also to see movie stars of that vintage. Dorothy Collins was more television, radio, but some of the who's the woman who sang Broadway Baby? Ethel Shutta and Hattie. What was her name? It was a whole generation of stars that was really a kind of last hurrah for them. And it was highly memorable. And I've seen about 6 Follies in different versions since then.
Was it the most memorable? If you could rate all the Follies you've seen, what did your 15-year-old self review it back then? What did you think?
I loved the staging, loved the songs. I had a problem with the book.
Do you still have a problem with the book?
Yes, I do. but I think it can be worked around. The music is celestial, and the music carries so much of the meaning, as it often does with Sondheim, because it's layer upon layer of memories within a single song, and also the sense of the past, kind of the friction between the past and the present, and sort of the paralysis that results sometimes when you're standing in the middle of the floor, not going left, not going right.
What was the first review you ever wrote when you were the chief critic? The first.
Well, I remember the first review I wrote, period. It would have been, for the Times, when I came on in 93, it was Annie Warbucks, which opened at the recently, now demolished, Variety Arts Theater, which is a shame. It's in my neighborhood in the East Village. It was a great old theater. And it wasn't a highly successful sequel, as sequels in musicals tend to be. First Broadway show, I don't think there was really a deciding point. Frank retired from theater criticism pretty soon after I arrived, really a matter of months. David Richards had the job for about a year. Then Vincent Canby, when David left, Vincent Canby, who was the film critic for many years, filled in for about 16 months. And during that time, I was reviewing stuff on Broadway, so I can't remember what the dividing point would have been. So by the time I actually stepped into the shoes officially, I'd been kind of shuffling along in them for a while.
When you did step into those shoes, or even just writing a Broadway review for the Times for the first time, did you have a moment when you're like, oof, that I joked about wanting to be the chief critic, and now I am, and now these words ripple through the world of theater all over. Did you have a moment before you put your fingers on the keys?
No, honestly, I didn't. Women's Wear Daily, where I started off, turned out to be the best graduate school you could have gone to in terms of at least psychological preparation for what I'm doing now. In those days, I presume it still is. It was an extremely powerful organ within a small, rarefied world. And you were told to say what you thought and just to go ahead with it and, damn the torpedoes. So to an extent, I guess I absorbed that. And I'm not incredibly confident in some areas in my life, but somehow in this I always have been. I do know my mind.
And what I find fascinating and what I love about what you do is obviously you have this incredible theatrical knowledge, but you're also an incredibly skilled writer at the same time. Two very different things. Where did the writing training come from? Is that what...
I come from a family of writers. Both my parents were journalists. My sister, who was 7 years older, came to New York before I did, and actually followed a similar trajectory in that she started off at the New Yorker and then went to the New York Times, where she was an editor for some years, then moved to California. My parents were very word, not obsessed, but they loved words, and they passed it on to us. We all started reading fairly early, and I also went to... I was also part of the kind of family that I would say was naturally critical. So when you were seated at the dinner table, if you said, "Oh, I really like that Dr. Seuss book," my dad would say, "And why did you like it?" So we learned how to shape our thoughts fairly well. But it came naturally. I was writing for newspapers by the time I was 10, and it was like a kid correspondent and so forth. And also went to a tiny college outside of Philadelphia called Swarthmore that was very sort of graduate preparatory, academic intensive, and went into the honors program in that, where you had to read an awful lot and sort of regurgitate an awful lot in a paper every week. And that was incredibly good training as well. So it all feeds into the same river.
And if you didn't end up following the career towards the chief drama critic seat, what else do you think you'd be doing?
Oh, probably academia. That was the obvious other path. They're both paths of minor resistance, journalism and academia. That's what my family background is. So it would have been one or the other, I think.
So tell me about your process for writing a review. Many of my listeners may still think that Broadway reviewers go on opening night, rush home, and then spit it out to get it before it arrives on sidewalks at 5 a.m. That's obviously not the case anymore. Can you just tell me a little bit about what you do?
And that tradition of going back and spitting it out, which was still current in Brooks Atkinson's day. I think it stopped like late 1960s, as long ago as that. But that's why we have seats on the aisle to this day. The idea being that you can rush back to the newspaper and get your work done. We usually have a few nights at least before the proper press opening, and we still write it as if it's the show that opened last night, or it's the show that opened Tuesday night when it runs in Wednesday's paper or is posted online late on Tuesday night. It comes fairly naturally to me. There's a moment when you're watching. I mean, you watch on two levels as a critic. I think there's the part of you that's kind of calculating the cerebellum or whatever it happens to be, that's processing it all and thinking, okay, do I have a lead here? Where is this play going? But then there's a part that you're watching with your gut too, which I think is the more important part. And so what you want to do is translate what you're feeling into what you're thinking. Because what you got to trust is the feeling much more. Then you can kind of intellectualize it if you want, or try to figure out why you responded in the way you do. I often write the next morning. When I was first in the job, I still take notes, but I don't really look at them again. It's sort of like tattooing. Once you've written it down, somehow it's inked into your memory. I usually write the next morning. It takes me a couple of hours, I'd say. And then, I don't work in the Times building. I keep an office downtown. And so, everything, thanks to the wonders of the internet, is sent, through the ether. And usually the next person I deal with is a copy editor at the Times. The Times has a fairly particular style about placement of commas and use of prepositions and so forth, so that you learn, but you sometimes forget. And they're wonderful. They save your ass so many times, the copy editors. And then it's online fairly quickly now.
And how much do the editors change, shorten, take out chunks? Does that happen at all?
No. I mean, I will be told that space is tight, and could I write, instead of 900 words, could I write 700 words? You have to be obliging about that. I do think all of us who write any kind of criticism for the Times, cultural criticism, feel incredibly lucky to have as much space as we're given. But no, no one's ever asked me to rethink something or change my opinion, and no one, and they're very good with critics, or very good, depending upon your point of view, but they're fairly respectful of critics in terms of they won't rewrite or change unless they consult with you.
My dean of undergraduate drama at NYU, Arthur Bartow, once said in a class, how I know I'm really enjoying a show is when I forget that I'm in academia in the theater.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't even imagine what that must be like for you. Do you ever get totally transported and forget, or are you always...
Oh, sure, yeah. I cry a lot at the theater.
You do?
Uh-huh.
What's the last show you cried? Do you remember?
Oh, gosh. I think it was... Oh, actually, it was a puppet show I saw... last week called Ada Ava, a very progressive puppet show, beautifully done by a troupe out of Chicago. And it was partly because it was so utterly original, and partly because you were so aware of these young people, I think they're all still in their 20s, adding another chapter to a theatrical tradition of entertainment. So I get moved pretty easily. It's rare that I go to something by Shakespeare that I don't have tears in my eyes at some point, really just from the language as much as anything else. And musicals, how can you not cry? Whether it's good or bad, there's just something about, people being able to find a rhythm, a song, and a dance, and, life's drudgery or agony or ecstasy that I find very moving.
Let's go back to the writing a little bit. And when you obviously don't really think about what you're doing in terms of the ripple effect like we talked about, but do you ever... I sometimes wonder what it must be like to be you and walk down 45th Street and look up at a marquee and see something, a quote that's been pulled,
right,
that maybe is just a little bit massaged or a little bit different than you ever anticipated it being. Does that happen to you?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, my editors, I think, take umbrage more than I do, and I think there's been a campaign waged by some of the more virtuous editors at the Times to put a stop to more egregious uses. As long as I get the sense right, I don't really care. I have learned, if I haven't read reviews and I see pull quotes, not to trust the pull quotes. But years ago, I mean, long before I had this job, I remember I was doing a piece for, I think, Harper's Bazaar magazine, a freelance piece, an interview with Catherine Deneuve. And wrote the piece. It was fine. She was appearing in a movie I hadn't yet seen, but we talked about it. And the deck, that is the copy right below the headline, said, "In this movie, Deneuve goes beyond stardom to become a spellbinding actress." Well, shortly after the magazine came out, I saw an ad for the movie, and it said, "Deneuve goes beyond starting to become a spellbinding actress." I had not seen the movie. I had not written those words. They were editorial window dressing that an editor had tacked onto it. So I've learned never, ever trust what you see critics saying in the ads.
Yeah, I'll admit it. I quoted a headline once of Jason Zinnemann's for an Off-Broadway show. He used to email my press agent all the time about it. I think he's forgiven me. I think. Speaking of those quotes, and if you've seen it, when you're writing, do you think, oh, they're going to quote this?
And sometimes if I do, if it seems just too blatant, I will stop and go back and change it. You don't, I mean, it's, I laugh till I cried kind of stuff. I mean, not that I say that very often, but people are, I mean, the ad people are pretty canny in terms of extracting things. Some press people do email and say, "Is this okay with you?" And again, if it doesn't change the sentence, it's usually fine with me.
Yeah, I've been in a number of those conversations where, can we say, and everyone looks at the press, I'll get back to you on that. And don't add an exclamation point. That's my other favorite. I want to ask a couple questions about the logistics of reviewing this city, which is filled with how many live entertainment events and live theatrical events you could cover. Obviously, there are many critics at the Times. You and Charles, how do you decide who reviews one Broadway show or another?
Well, I get first choice. If Charles is seeing something out of town, our policy is usually to let whoever's reviewed it out of town review it again, unless that person really didn't like it the first time and thinks it might be fair to let the other critic do it. I try to do as much off Broadway as I can because I think there's usually more of interest there. Obviously, the news is what's happening on Broadway, and that's where the commercial interest is. But if you're looking for innovation, you don't look to Broadway. I mean, that's, it's if it comes to Broadway and it's new, it's been new somewhere else before. So, I do try to get to the periphery as much as I can.
And how does it, so I'm sure there are plenty of off-Broadway theater companies and artists listening to this right now going, oh my gosh, if I could only get Ben to see my show. How do you find out about all these shows? This puppet show from Chicago.
Oh, yeah, that was actually the theater editor, Scott Heller, has a thing for puppets, and he said this might be interesting. And it was something I'd actually noticed on my own. I do read the press releases that are, that fill up my email box. And also word of mouth. I mean, I do have friends who are I don't really have any friends in the theater, but I do have friends who are ardent theater goers, especially downtown or south of downtown, Brooklyn, whatever, who know certain companies or certain artists involved and said, you might want to check this out. This summer, for the first time, I've seen everything that Clubbed Thumb is doing, simply because the artistic director wrote to me and said, could you just take a look at what we're doing? You haven't yet. And I thought, well, that's fair. So I did. I can't always say yes, unfortunately. I mean, my first obligations, obviously, are to the news-making bigger productions. But when I go to London, I try to see as much that's not West End as I can as well. Because there's a lot of creativity out there. It's just not always in the obvious places.
You just said something which I found pretty interesting. You said you don't have any friends in the theater industry, and someone who loves it so much and is so involved, you'd think, oh, sure, you've got lots of friends. Is that by choice?
Oh, yeah, totally, yeah. You can't really write about someone you know. It's just, it's too uncomfortable. My parents were friends with Julie Harris, so I was never actually able to review Julie Harris, who was an idol of mine when I was a kid. Occasionally, there's certain anecdotes I truck out at this moment. A friend of mine gives great dinner parties, beautifully assembled dinner parties, sort of like Pearl Mesta kind of gatherings. And after she was giving a dinner for Simon Russell Beale, the British actor, and he had just come to New York, was doing Uncle Vanya and Twelfth Night in Repertory. My review came out, and she called and said, "Oh, it's a great review. Can't you come? It's a big party, blah, blah." I said, "Oh, all right. He's English. It's not." And it's a slightly different relationship, I think, that the actors have with the theater industry has with the critics there. So I arrived, and we're all standing, in the living room with our cocktails, and someone sees Simon and me in the same room and says, "Wait a minute, you guys aren't supposed to be in the same room, are you?" And someone else said, "Oh, I think it's all right. Didn't he just write that Simon was the greatest classical actor of his generation?" And Simon said, "No." He said, "Perhaps the greatest classical actor of his generation."
That must have made for some interesting conversation afterwards. And since then, no friends with you. No more cocktail parties.
Oh, no. Occasionally, you'll sit down beside someone you reviewed. Sometimes just inevitably, if you go out, you do see people. No, it's I don't even like to interview people that I'm going to be reviewing later, because you have a certain kind of insider's information that's not quite fair, and you're emotionally invested, I think, in their doing well for reasons that don't suit a critic.
I want to go back and ask that question about the policy about reviewing out of town and reviewing in. That's a Times policy, right? I've always wondered why that is. Only because sometimes I think, wouldn't it be great just to have two people, whether they like it or don't like it, just two totally different perspectives, just to put them side by side, if you will.
Well, often something will move. For example, I don't think Charles was all that keen on Fun Home, which I loved, obviously. And so if that had come to Broadway and he'd reviewed it and said, "This is nothing," I don't think he would have, but you know what I mean. It would have been much more respectful. It's especially if it's been a very encouraging review that has helped producers perhaps decide to bring it in. It doesn't really seem fair to give it to someone who might possibly slam it.
That's a very good point. I guess just make the set policy that way.
Right.
You get it either way. Although I remember when I first moved to the city and started going to see shows, sometimes you got two reviews. You had a Sunday review, right?
Yeah, you did. And I'm sorry that doesn't exist anymore. I like there being different voices. Even when I was after I became the first string critic, Margot Jefferson was doing it for a while on Sunday, and then Vincent was doing it on Sunday. I don't know why that was discontinued, but I sort of miss it.
Oh, we'll try to bring it back. Everyone write letters to the editor of the Times. Bring back the Sunday review. So obviously our Tony season has just ended, which this period of time, March, April, it's got to be the busiest time of the year for you.
Yeah, it is.
How many shows a week do you see?
Oh, maybe 5.
5 shows.
Yeah.
Is it tiring?
No, I do more in London, actually. There I'll see like 10 or 12 shows a week, because you can, because of the way matinees are staggered. No, it's, you get, I suppose you want to collapse at the end of it, but you do get into a groove where it's just and momentum builds, sort of self-perpetuating. You worry about getting careless just in terms of spellings and so forth, factual things, if you've been on a blitzkrieg. But I wouldn't want it to be like that all year, but there's something kind of exhilarating about a concentrated period of openings like that.
And what do you think about reviewing and how it's changed over the past? How long has it been? So you started in 93. So over those few decades now, how has writing a review or reviewing in general changed?
Well, I think it was beginning to change even under Frank Rich, in that you couldn't take the public's interest in theater for granted anymore. It used to be such a central part of the New York conversation, and it hasn't been for a long time. I think you have to raise your voice a little more. I think you have to be more emphatic. Also, we're in a culture now where people don't light, nuanced opinion. I mean, some people may respect it. I mean, I certainly do, but it confuses people. They want to go, "Did you like it or did you not hate it?" I mean, really, it's one extreme or the other.
Sounds like a website. Did you like
Yes, it does. And it's. I mean, the reviews I'm usually proudest of are mixed reviews, so-called mixed reviews, because they're the hardest to write, and where you balance this and this and let people extract what they will. But I do think you have to, well, we're obviously a much more celebrity-driven culture than we were when I started. There's always been that aspect to America, but it seems to be dominant now. If there's a famous name in the cast, you make sure the famous name in the cast is mentioned very early on in the review. I think that's unfortunately essential. Also, there's a much bigger community of critics, even as the professional critics are shrinking in number. Anyone can set up a website or use a Twitter account to project his or her own opinions. So there is a big garden of different voices screaming to be heard out there, and if you're willing to do the research, that is, visit a number of sites, you might find someone whose tastes are perfectly in tune with yours. That's not why I read criticism. I mean, even when I was a kid, I don't read criticism to know whether I should see something or not. It's not so much as a consumer. I just like the dialogue it creates in your mind, which I think is still ideally what it should be, but if you're writing for a daily newspaper, you are to some extent a consumer advocate.
Have you poked around any of the message boards or other sites at all?
Oh no, that way madness lies.
And what do you think about our current state of Broadway right now? Where do you think, if it was a patient in a hospital,
right,
if you will, would it be dying, critical, healthy, ready for it? Is it good?
Oh, I think it's pretty robust. There have been some transfusions recently that I think have really, really helped it. I mean, if you look at the slate of Tony nominees this year, it's encouraging. It's and the fact that the shows that won, Fun Home for Best Musical and Curious Senston of the Dog in the Nighttime for Best Play, each is a show in its genre unlike anything that's been on Broadway before. And I find that incredibly encouraging. And my hat off to the Tony voters for going in that direction. I mean, Curious Senston, it was sort of a no-brainer, because even though it's fairly technologically advanced and is ingeniously showing the point of view of an autistic teenager, it nonetheless has sort of the both the spectacle and the sort of feel-good qualities that I think people want in a hit play. But it's highly original, and it's using, I think, technology in a way that hasn't been used before. And Fun Home, it's not just the subject matter; it's the scale of it that I think makes it such an unlikely winner. It's a very internal musical, very interior. It's the landscape of someone's mind. Well, they both are in different ways. I enjoyed last season. I mean, again, the winner for Best Revival, Skylight, fabulous revival. One of the best I've seen in years. And probably David Hare's best play, made a case for that. I was pretty happy at the end of the season.
You predicted, did you predict American in Paris would win?
Yeah.
So you must have been quite surprised then.
I was surprised. I was pleasantly surprised. As my math teacher said whenever I got anything right on exams.
And what about, we talked a little bit about stars on Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
You've also seen an infusion of star writers, if you will, over the last several years, from Sting to Larry David.
Right.
What do you think about these big star names coming into Broadway?
Well, I mean, the proof, I suppose, is in the box office receipts. I mean, Larry David didn't get great reviews for Fish in the Dark, but especially as long as he was in it. I think it was as much a matter of his presence as his name, as his byline, so to speak, that brought people in. Sting, well, I mean, it's great that he wants to try. Do you know? Sheryl Crow is working on a musical now. A lot of people from other disciplines. Steve Martin is working on a musical now that's coming in. Why not? I think it's nice that theater has. I mean, it's so often perceived as kind of square. I think it's nice when it has a slight coolness quotient. when it's something that people actually want to do. I mean, you could say that it's also a place where dead stars go to have their careers reborn. But I don't really think that's true. I mean, when Julia Roberts made her Broadway debut, that wasn't the reason. It was just something she wanted to do. Nicole Kidman, it actually, I think, really did help professionally. But theater's a testing ground, and it's good, I think, that it challenges people who are already proven successes in other fields.
You ever get angry letters from producers or actors?
Well, sure. I mean, actually, the most public, the nastiest responses have been public responses. Josh Brolin, actually accepting an award years ago for Best Supporting Actor, I think. Maybe it was for Milk or No Country for Old Men. When he accepted his award, he said, "Oh, you critics, you don't make it. I don't really care too much." He said, "Except for Ben Brantley. God, I hate that motherfucker." And I didn't know anything about it until the New York Post called me the next day or sent me an email. And
Riedel, he sent you an email.
It wasn't Riedel, no. It was no, it was someone from Page Six. And which would have heard about it because it wasn't really Riedel's beat. And I sent so I said, for what it's worth, I've really liked his work. He was it was actually a review of True West in which he replaced Philip Seymour Hoffman, which was a really tough thing to do, which I acknowledged in the review, but they just weren't ready to do it. So that was what he was, and it had been maybe 5 years since then, and obviously he was still smarting. So I said, for what it's worth, I really enjoyed him as the guy who tried to kill Harvey Milk and as the raging guy on The Lam and No Country for Old Men. I said he really seems to have found something constructive to do with his anger, and I got an email from him, I think, that day saying, "Loved your comments in the Post, no harm, no foul, XX." And we've been sort of email my acquaintances since. Alec Baldwin wrote something for the Huffington Post basically saying I should be put to death. And James Franco, after what was actually not a terribly mean review for Mice and Men, what was it? He called me a little bitch on an Instagram post. Said that no wonder the whole theater world hated me. It's kind of fun when that happens. It gets people talking. It makes it seem sort of like we're still living in the All About Eve era. It's nice that it evokes that kind of passion from people. And does it personally hurt my feelings? No. Not something like that.
It's so obvious to me, even this short conversation, how much you love the theater and also love writing about the theater, for the theater, and hope it can continue to foster. Will you just keep writing and writing? Is your idea to keep being the critic for as long as you can keep writing? I guess.
One thing I have learned, I spent a lot of time before I was at the Times doing profiles of people, interviewing people. And I did learn that whenever they predicted something, they'd almost invariably be wrong. So I have learned myself never to predict what's going to happen with me. But if it all stopped tomorrow, I've gotten to do exactly what I wanted in life. I have no complaints.
In all your years of theater going, I would even say as the critic, if you could only see one production that you've seen already, again, for the rest of your life, every day. In other words, what's your most favorite thing?
Oh, that is so tough. Because of course, it's also much a matter of when you see it, what's happened up to that point. So you'd have to go back to put yourself in time at that point too. I was so happy at Book of Mormon the first time I saw it. I was so moved by Janet McTeer's performance in A Doll's House, but I think if it were one show, it would be the Globe Theater's 12th Night with Mark Rylance.
That's a very interesting point you just made about the timing of things. When you see something, how it resonates. That's what's great about theater. It's
of course.
What you're bringing into it and what you take away. have you ever seen a play? Let's say you saw a play 10 years ago, and you're like, that's okay.
Yeah.
10 years later, you see it again and go, oh my gosh, this is...
Well, but again, it's a question of, theater, and that's the glory of theater, or one of the glories of theater. It exists in the present moment, and it's a confluence of so many different elements. And True West, I didn't see the early production, but it was famously disastrous, the Sam Shepard play, when Joseph Papp directed it at the Public Theater. And then suddenly it's reborn through Steppenwolf, because there are people who have an understanding of it. It becomes exciting. I mentioned A Doll's House with Janet McTeer. At the time I went to see that, I thought, oh, not another Doll's House. And suddenly it seems reborn. I think the best revivals, there are, perfectly pleasant revivals, passable revivals, but I think the best ones are the ones that do make you rethink and say, but this is new, or this must have been what it must have. That one response is, this must have been what it was like to see it when it opened, even though it's been retranslated for our times. This is the kind of energy and newness that it must have had, the freshness. I thought even the current revival of On the Town, when I saw that out of town in the Berkshires in a small summer theater, I thought, because people have been trying to get that right for so long in revival, I thought, well, this gives you a sense of what it must... First of all, you realize the show was about sex, which wasn't really clear in other revivals. It's about horny sailors, on shore leave, and suddenly making connections and feeling it could all be over very quickly. And I found that very moving this time around, which I hadn't expected. So... and there have even, once when I saw the musical, when I saw it downtown at the New York Theater Workshop, I liked it, but I didn't love the book. I still don't love the book, even though I adore the guy who wrote it, Enda Walsh. I think he's a marvelous playwright. But when I saw it on Broadway in a bigger space, with things scaled up just a little bit, I thought, oh, this is so cool. Really, to have this on Broadway, and it's a new vocabulary in musicals. It doesn't sound like any other musical. And I found myself being, not only liking it more, appreciating it more, but being more moved by it the second time around. So people say, do you ever think you were wrong? And the answer, the arrogant answer is no, because you're writing what you're doing is you're writing about what you saw as you saw it at that moment. And that changes. As I said, the glory of theater is that it changes from moment to moment. No performance will ever be the same, and you will never be the same person who sees the next performance.
Fascinating. Anything this season you're looking forward to? Can you tell us what you're looking forward to this coming year?
Oh, I'm looking forward to seeing Hamilton again. It'll be interesting to see that in a larger theater. That was incredible. Well, you were asking me what the last year was like for me. It was incredible to have that, too. Again, things that keep changing the vocabulary at a moment when you think, the musical's sort of falling down or an outmoded form, then something like Hamilton comes up, or Natasha and Pierre in The Great Comet of 1812, or Preludes by the same composer, Dave Malloy. There's life in the old gal yet.
Okay, last question. I want you to imagine that the genie from Aladdin, which you didn't review Aladdin.
No, I didn't review Aladdin.
Did you see it?
No, I haven't seen it. No.
You haven't seen it. Okay, so we can't ask you your official comment. So the genie from Aladdin shows up at your office in the East Village and says, Ben, the passion you've shown for the business and your incredible writing, you deserve a gift. No more angry letters from Alec Baldwin. I want to give you one wish. One wish. What drives you so crazy about Broadway or the theater? What keeps you up at night? The thing that makes you angry that this genie could, with the snap of a finger, make disappear? What would be the wish that you ask?
Inflated ticket prices, I'd ask to disappear. I'd like Broadway to be more accessible to more people. I think it would be a much more interesting place if people didn't have to worry so much about charging so much and justifying the cost of admission.
Very good answer. I'll see what I can do about it.
I next show.
Ben, I want to thank you so much for being here, and also just thank you for your passion. I have to say that even when I don't agree with you, and I actually agree with you more often than not, I always love reading your reviews. They're so well written, and obviously your love and your passion really shine through every single one of them. So thank you for being here. Thanks to all of you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. We've got great people coming up. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast, everybody. Don't forget, if you're looking for space for your reading, your workshop, or your full production, check out davenporttheater.com. That's davenporttheater.com.